Hi there, this is Kurt with Leverlo. I was recently meeting with two ministry leaders, and we were discussing just creating some resources for them, designing them with Leverlo. It's something that Leverlo also does, and kind of the idea of how do we transition to becoming a disciple-making movement, like these two ministry leaders were discussing that. So I wanted to put together this little video because this question comes up a lot. So for the purposes of this conversation, I'm just going to define a disciple-making movement as a movement that's seeing fourth generation fruit. So one person who has discipled someone else, who has discipled someone else, who has discipled someone else. So you see in this visual that fourth generation fruit. And I think one of the main things to just be aware of if you're trying to transition is just that this is often a adaptive change. It's not just plug in some different content. It's a little bit deeper than that. So you see this iceberg here, and I think the things that we see, the things that are visible, kind of the tip of the iceberg that's above the water, are activities and structures. I think that's where people generally lean to as kind of a starting point with how to transition to something like a disciple-making movement. But it's often very important to realize that there are paradigms in certain cultures, and then if you go even farther down, core beliefs and convictions that are going to be needed to factor in to kind of trying to get there. So another way to think about that is if you think of the core beliefs and convictions as the foundation of your house, the paradigms and culture of your ministry or organization as kind of the framing, and then the activities and the structures, again, those are the visible things. That's the exterior, that's the paint on the wall, it's what you see. So in these kind of situations where you're trying to transition towards a disciple-making movement, you often have to go all the way to the foundation. So it would be easy if it was just changing a coat of paint, but there's often different paradigms or different core beliefs or convictions that need to be addressed. So it's helpful to understand that this is the reality going into it. Another way to look at this is to think about Simon Sinek with his kind of diagram that has why at the center. So why kind of being that paradigms. You have to dig all the way to the root issue. So that kind of gets us to thinking about what does it look like as a leader to move forward, and if you're going to move in this direction to try to see a disciple-making movement, try to transition your organization or ministry to that, one of the huge things is you need to keep kind of again and again hitting the vision of that. And this diagram is kind of representing how that vision is going to leak. So you're going to have to say it again and again and again. Another thing that's important is because this is not just kind of finding some different missional or disciple-making content and plugging it in, it's more of an adaptive change. One of the roles that you take on as a leader is regulating the temperature. So you see over here, if you don't bring enough heat, if you don't try to emphasize the change enough, nothing's really going to happen. Nothing's going to get cooked. But if you make huge changes out the bat, or you come on a little bit too strongly, you're going to burn the food. So one way to think about this, and this is actually from Todd Bolsinger's book, Canoeing the Mountains, is regulating the temperature. So your job as a leader is not to find the perfect content, not to find or design the perfect system, but it's more to regulate this change process, regulate the temperature of the change process. And when we think about this adaptive change process, it is a bit of you kind of start and then it goes all over the place before you really find success. So one way to really think about framing this is as a learning journey, and not doing it solo, but as a community. So a learning community that's moving forward. And I have kind of referenced down here, leverlo.com/coaching. One of the things that's super important, whether it's with a Leverlo coach or just coaching yourself, is to have someone helping you walk through this process, because when you hit the first barrier, when things don't go exactly how you want to have someone there who can help you kind of navigate. So I have some free resources on this link if you check that out. And you can also contact if you would like to be coached by Leverlo as well. So this is just super important because, like I said, it's going to be a process of learning and trying and doing something else and then going backwards before you go forwards. And that's just going to be needing, one way to really frame that is really as a learning community. So when I say that, what that really looks like is you learn something, you try to apply that, and then you stop and reflect, and then you just keep repeating that. So I think oftentimes we want to jump from like where we are now to the final solutions, but we need to take a more iterative approach. So try one little thing, make a change, reflect on it. How did that go? Try something else, make a change. And over time, that's going to aggregate to the solution that you want to get to. Another way to really think about that idea of a learning community is that we often want to jump straight to the solution space. We want to start thinking immediately, how can I solve this problem? What can we do differently? But it's important, and this is kind of some design thinking here, to spend time in the problem space as well. So let me highlight that with a quick story that I heard from Alan Hirsch. So there once was a company, they sold drill bits, and they needed to kind of improve their product, so they thought, how can we make this drill bit better? So they immediately jumped to the solution space, and they looked at different materials, different ways of doing it. But eventually, they had like this diamond carbide tip drill bit, and they couldn't make it any better. So what they ended up doing is going back to the problem space and really kind of thinking like, what are we actually trying to do here? So instead of trying to just keep making the current solution better, they went back and like, what problem are we really trying to solve here? And really, what a drill bit company is trying to do, like the job there, is to drill holes. And this company, because they went and all the way back to the problem space instead of just staying in solution space, ended up inventing the laser. So that's just kind of an interesting story. So if you think about that from a ministry perspective, say you're a church that has a worship service, you could just get the band to sing better, get better music, get better preaching, but you could go back here and ask better questions. So solution space, maybe in that example, you're just, how can we improve what we already have? But going back to the problem space, you're asking a different question. How can we put disciple making at the core of what we're doing? And maybe that really is going to need to take time to, as a learning community, wrestle with what problem are we really trying to solve and kind of going backwards. Again, that process is not linear and forward all the time. So another kind of learning community diagram to think about is Roger Martin's knowledge funnel. So what you're currently doing in your ministry is you have some sort of algorithm, but you want to kind of go all the way back up and re-engage with a different mystery. So the mystery might have been that created your current algorithm, to use that example from before, the mystery of how can we have the best church service possible? And you find some heuristics, you find some principles, like, oh, if we have solid preaching, if we have a great worship band, and then you've kind of nailed it. But now we're going all the way back up here and saying, how do we see a disciple-making movement happen? And there's so many question marks. Everything's a little bit jumbled. But as a learning community, you learn, you apply, you reflect, some things start to stand out. You find some heuristics, you find some principles that if 9 times out of 10 you try to do it this way, it's going to work. And eventually you'll get to an algorithm. Now, it's important to note this is a very long process. You do not do this overnight. You do not do this over a weekend. So the way to think about this, again, from that iteration standpoint, so this is some lean startup, kind of Eric Ries's minimum viable product. If you're trying to become a disciple-making movement, don't jump straight to the Ferrari. So this kind of diagram is the idea of, if you're trying to get from point A to point B, start small. Start with a skateboard. Start with 1 or 2 people trying out this disciple-making idea you have, instead of taking your entire ministry and having this perfect system that you think is going to go scale it down, and then scale it down again until you have something super simple. And over time, you can find like, oh, we got this working. Let's upgrade that to something a little bit bigger, and then over time, upgrade it again. And eventually, you might get to something that looks a little bit more streamlined, but you have to start very small. And the last piece about the learning community that I'll mention is really the goal is not to have a perfectly designed kind of disciple-making structure or system. The goal is to have a system that your people own, that there's a high degree of ownership. So this means you can't go off by yourself as a leader of a ministry and come up with the perfect system or do all the learning by yourself. You want your people engaged in that process as well, because the only way they're going to own that is if they have a high degree of awareness. So if you're advocating for solutions, but they don't even understand why they need that, they have no awareness around that, it's not going to work. And then accountability. So that's going to help them kind of slowly over time. So people resist change. That's a reality. So as you do this learning community process, you want to help them take small steps so they become aware, like, oh, maybe this way that we're gathering is not conducive to disciple making. Well, let's stay accountable to taking small steps forward with that. So that's kind of this whole idea of a learning community. So the last thing I'll touch on is just kind of a tangible tool that you guys can use to move forward. So it's this idea of discussing two different rooms, the lower room and the upper room. So this lower room here, so it's just a one-story building, represents your ministry activities, your ministry programs. So someone comes in, so this could be any gathering. It could be a small group, community group, Sunday service, whatever kind of that looks like for your ministry. It's the gatherings that you host. And when someone comes in, what it looks like is you have someone who's doing the ministry and those who are being ministered to, and it's really about executing the gathering. So in this situation, I love Hugh Halter. So this concept with the lower room, upper room is from Will Mancini, but then Hugh Halter talks about this idea of a first decision versus a second decision environment. And lower rooms are great first decision environments where people can make decisions to follow Jesus. So you can try to get them to come. So I think we've tried to get people to come to our house. We have Bible studies that maybe they're interested in the topics, or some of our lost friends will host food around different holidays. So you're trying to draw people in to some sort of gathering, and that's where you can really share about Jesus and see ministry happen, and you're trying to really execute that ministry there. Now, to contrast that, so this is, you still have the lower room, but adding an upper room. And the difference here is some people have been invited up into the upper room, and while downstairs ministry is happening, upstairs is where people get equipped for ministry. And the key difference here is the vision for the ministry is really within the group of people upstairs. So if I change some of the lower room activities, say I used to serve free food at my events and now I don't, some people might leave. And with that change, they're no longer a part of it. But the people in the upper room, this vision it's kind of etched in marble, as Will Mancini likes to say. And because of that, no matter what you do in the lower room, they're going to stick around because they're committed to the upper room vision. So you could change things down here, but that vision stays the same. And this is a second decision environment. This is where people are seeking to not only follow Jesus, but to live their lives like him. And this is where we see people getting equipped for ministry, and this is where we see disciple makers. So we still need the lower room, but we also need to think about, for disciple making and to see a disciple making movement, how do we have an upper room as well? So one way to think about that is with your lower room, like I said, we're not trying to get rid of that. If you have all the people that you might potentially invite to that space, then you have the people who start showing up maybe once or twice, and then you have the people who you might call partners, people who at least half the time, if you're hosting some sort of gathering, they're going to show up. So this is just a framework. So if we flip to the upper room, you see that this kind of funnel shifts. So in the lower room, it's a funnel that's tons of people, the many people becoming few. But if you look at the upper room, it's one person becoming many. And this is Jesus's model for discipleship and disciple making. He often did lower room activities. He often fed the masses. You think of the feeding of the 5,000 as a good example. But while he was feeding the 5,000, he had an upper room at that feeding. He had the 12 disciples who he was kind of teaching them and pulling them aside. So we see, for the purpose of this video, I'm going to kind of call that top person the coach, and they're individually investing in some people that we'll call the equippers, and these equippers are individually investing in apprentices. So if you look at the lower room from a disciple-making pathway to make this super tangible, you have the crowd, and then it becomes guests, and those guests eventually become partners. But this is kind of where it stops. So you might say there's some leaders, like you could add in like leader, but really if you're in a lower room gathering and you look around, there are not many other spaces for you to kind of step into like a leadership position other than the person who's maybe leading it. So we see that the lower room doesn't have avenues for disciple making. So what we need to do is add in the upper room. So we have the crowd, you have everyone that you invite to your stuff, you have guests, people who are showing up, and you have partners who are showing up regularly. But from there, you need to have clear avenues, a clear staircase up to the upper room. And this is where your vision for disciple making needs to be super clear. And then you just also have to have these avenues. So do you have an upper room? Do you have avenues for people to become, so an apprentice, someone who's learning what it means to be a disciple maker, an equipper, someone who is a disciple maker and they're equipping other disciples, and a coach who's helping steward that. So when you look at I have another slide that I didn't include, but when you look at this, this is really fourth generation fruit. The coach investing in the equipper, who's investing in apprentices, who's learning how to invest in partners. So this is a super helpful framework that you need to just consider if you're trying to shift towards becoming a disciple-making movement. And then just if you want to talk more about this, every weekday I post a diagram such as the ones I had in this video. You can find it on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. Just search for @leverlow.com, /dot And also feel free to email me. I'd love to continue the conversation, kurt@leverlow.com. So just some of the offerings that Leverlow currently has to help with this transition. So with that kind of adaptive change process, one of the huge things is you're trying to shift culture, you're trying to shift paradigms. And one of the great ways to do that is as you're learning, as the community is picking up and trying different things, is to capture those learnings in stories. And that's where vision casting can be so powerful. So if you go to the leverlow.com/story, you can see a bunch of resources, as well as there's an online virtual course that you can sign up for that teaches you just a super simple framework. So say someone's doing outreach and maybe it goes well, maybe it goes poorly. You can capture that learning, that experience into a story and pass it on. So you see in this diagram, often what we try to communicate, so this idea here, is not completely understood. And especially when you're trying to do something like an adaptive change process and shifting paradigms, you want to make sure when you are communicating that you're understood. And one of the best ways to do that is by stories. We see that with Jesus in the parables. So if you want some resources around that, check out leverlow.com/story. And then we're also starting to offer an innovation workshop. So this is something we're just putting together with Leverlow. So space is going to be limited, but if you're interested, you can kind of join the waitlist at leverlow.com/workshop, and I'll be updating with more details there as they become available. And lastly, if you haven't already, I put together a missional community field guide. I think it's 80 plus pages, and even in there, there's a section you see here, transitioning to missional communities, that you can check out to see this topic expanded a little bit more. So it's going to be at leverlow.com. I'm not going to leave it up there for a huge amount of time. It's currently free, so if you just go there, you can get the download. So check that out as well. And that's all. So thank you for this video. I hope it was helpful as you think about transitioning to missional communities.